got a few of panels that will look into specific streams that were designed for this summit. Streams that include media, the arts, museums, and heritage. But now we will start with looking at some of the challenges that media is facing in the age of technology. Again, through the lens and theme of the summit, cultural responsibility and technology. So I would like to welcome John Prideaux, US editor of The Economist, to the floor, and allow him to, well, take and invite him. Yes.
Thank you very much. That's working. What a pleasure to be here. And also to follow His Excellency Zaki Nasebi, who I was at university in England with Zaki's two daughters, one of whom is here today. And I remember them telling me when I was about 18, 19, that they had this dad who spoke about 12 languages fluently and had a library with hundreds of books and was basically like Wikipedia on legs before Wikipedia was invented. And I remember thinking then, I'd kind of like to be like that guy one day. And obviously I haven't got that far, but it's a great pleasure to see you again. My name's John Prideaux. I'm the US editor of The Economist, which means that I'm responsible for The Economist's coverage of the United States. I spend a lot of time thinking about Donald Trump. This is going to be a lovely break from that for me. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about how media can survive, and hopefully not only survive, but thrive in an age where technology is changing very fast. Journalists are completely obsessed by technology, partly because you can't really understand the forces that change society unless you're interested in the technology, partly for selfish reasons, that technology is always upending our business models, and also partly because technology is changing all the time what it is to do journalism and also what it is to be a reader and really a citizen. If you have one of these in your pocket, as I do, then you can launch your own podcast, you can launch a website, you can write infinite numbers of articles and send them out there and see if anyone wants to read them. I discovered recently that there are 700,000 podcasts on iTunes at the moment. That's not episodes of podcasts, that's actual podcasts. You couldn't listen to all of those, even if you dedicated your entire life to doing so. So there are challenges that come as kind of readers and consumers of media. We want to be well informed, but we have this deluge of stuff coming at us, and we'd have to try and work out what's worthy of our attention, what's not. We have to reckon with the problem of filter bubbles. A lot of media companies have grown very savvy, have figured out that actually what people want is not so much to be challenged by what they read or what they listen to, but to have their prejudices confirmed so they don't have to think too hard. That's a big problem for us. So without further ado, we've got a great panel here this morning to talk about all these things. I'm going to introduce them one by one. First of all, somebody who I think a bunch of you will know already, Mina Al-Arabi, who is editor of The Nation. Mina, grab a seat. We've got John Defterios, who covers emerging markets for CNN. John, welcome. Have a seat. And we've got Shashi Menon, who is CEO of Navura, a company you may not know, but you may know some of the magazines he publishes. There's a little one called Vogue, and Wired is also one of his in this neck of the woods. And there's another one which I didn't know about, but we've just been talking about, called Pop Sugar, which may be the most interesting of the lot for you guys today. Anyway, Shashi, welcome. Right. John, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay. I mean, this panel is looking at how technology's changed media and how media can thrive or be destroyed by technology. CNN, where you've been for a while, in some senses was a business, an opportunity created by a technological innovation. You know, cable news became possible, CNN came along. But then, more recently, you've had to face all sorts of challenges from innovation. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. It was great that you go back to the founder, Ted Turner, who, in fact, when I was a student at USC, and Sasha, I went to the same university in Los Angeles, I had a poster in my dorm room that said, "I was in cable before cable was cool." I mean, Ted Turner was, he had a guitar and a cowboy hat, and people thought he was nuts because he was going to leverage the cable to revolutionize news. And in fact, I interned for CNN in the 1980s in its third year on air when nobody knew what it was. They called it chicken noodle news because nobody knew what it was. We were trying to make a phone call to set up an interview or something. There was no real response because we didn't have that much of a profile. It was a revolution driven, as you're suggesting, by technology. I noticed you held up your phone and said there's been a revolution because of the smartphone. I've been at CNN, this is my 25th year, in many different locations. But the real revolution came over the last 10 with the advent of the smartphone. It was an incredibly laborious process when you were on assignment before. Been fortunate enough to cover the Gulf War, for example, 1991, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which happened in '89. It was all a satellite-driven coverage at the time. You had to book a satellite truck, move it to the location, book your satellite windows. It was a very expensive operation. And over the weekend, I was at the World Economic Forum and did an interview with the Prime Minister of Jordan. That was ingested into a laptop. It was compressed within 5 minutes, and I could send it over broadband, and they received it in Atlanta anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes. And we can use the laptop now to go live from anywhere in the world, which is extraordinary. My colleague during the Iranian elections, Fred Pleitgen, wasn't able to get a signal on broadband because they don't have the investment in 3G, let alone 4G, and going to 5G technology. So they pulled out the smartphone, and we're going live from the polling stations with a smartphone. It is incredible. We also use live view technology, which is bundling 4 to 8 SIM cards in a backpack, and the cameraman can go up within 15 seconds. You can be live from anywhere. So it's been an absolute revolution from the first days of where CNN built its reputation in the Gulf War, having to be hunkered down by satellite technology to, as you suggest, you can go live from anywhere, anytime.
So, Mina, there's a lot of benefits there to people who watch news or read news. It's become cheaper in some senses to produce, easier, more convenient. But you run a newspaper. We're in the same business in some sense. The trends that technology has brought to our business have made life pretty tough.
It has. In some ways, print journalism has also been revolutionized by technology, but it's really user expectations have changed, whether they're readers, whether they're viewers, whether they're listeners. So today, and again, similarly, The National, The Economist, and publications around the world can no longer just depend on the written word. And that goes down to user expectations. And yes, of course, the smartphone played a big part of it. So now we can no longer just depend on a 600, 800-word article. We have to think how we're visualizing it, how we could add video to it. Is there a podcast that goes with it? So in some ways, it's been amazing because we can diversify what we're doing out of a newspaper, but at the same time, it means a lot of strain on resources and also how you're equipping journalists now. You can no longer have a journalist, you have expectations. When I started in journalism, not that long ago, 15 years, but in 15 years, the change that's happened where before I literally had my dictaphone, my notepad, my pen, and I could go anywhere. Now, any of my journalists go somewhere, I have to think, is there a multimedia producer with them? Do they have the right, not dictaphone, but Zoom microphone that they could actually use the audio for different elements to be covered? So it's made us more exciting. I always think about, if you've seen the movie Minority Report, where you're sitting in the underground or the metro and the newspaper is literally being updated as you sit there. That's what we're doing now. We're no longer comfortable with thinking, when is the paper going to bed? Because the paper never goes to bed. It's constantly being updated. And so in some ways, it's great because it means we can cover live, whereas before with a newspaper, you think, how do I keep my headline fresh for tomorrow morning? You're constantly keeping it fresh online now. It's also frustrating because it means we're constantly having to remind ourselves that we can't be chasing after our tail. If there are now 350,000 tweets a minute updating all the time, some of it is noise, but some of it is actual news generation, we cannot be tweeting all the time. We cannot be pushing out news alerts all the time. We remain a newspaper, but if my reader believes that the National is not going to be the most up-to-date, they will go elsewhere. And that competition makes it very difficult. People ask me, who's your competition for the National? We're a newspaper that's been based out of Abu Dhabi for 11 years, and yet 50% of my readership online now comes from abroad. And so I have to think of them. They're going to be reading The Economist. They're going to be reading their local paper. They're going to be checking social media accounts. How do I stay relevant to them? And that's made it challenging, but also in some ways made our journalism stronger.
Shashi, the publications you oversee span a range from more traditional publications, a bit like The National and The Economist in Vogue, title that's been around forever, to Wired, which is totally obsessed with technology, to Pop Sugar, which is kind of built for the internet and this kind of sharing news economy. How do you think about the challenges that all this brings? I mean, I suppose there's this selfish point, how do we make money? But that's probably less interesting for the people here in the room, and more interesting, perhaps, how it affects the journalism we do.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Mina said is that consumer expectations have changed, but on another level, they haven't at all. I think the root kernel that still is the most important is to produce something that matters and something that people care about. And I think even though technology has changed the medium and the visualization of it, if you don't produce something that people actually care about, you don't exist. And that's been true forever. So I think that's the way that we try to think about what we're doing. Technology is a great tool to help change how we produce content and how we distribute it, but it doesn't solve the root problem of producing something that is meaningful. And I think where a lot of companies have gone wrong in the media space is looking at technology as just a platform for scale, and scale for scale's sake, which I think is a fool's errand. And a lot of the companies that have gone down that path at the expense of producing actually meaningful content and thinking about who they're serving and why are failing as a result. And so, interestingly enough, like if you look at what we're doing, 2 years ago we launched a magazine, which I don't think is conventional wisdom in this era. And I come from a background of purely digital and spent my career predicting the demise of print and have turned myself into a believer. And I think it's because amidst things like Mina talked about, 350,000 tweets a second, information overload, the role of curation matters a heck of a lot more than it used to. And that's what media and good media can do. It can help to provide a very curated lens on a specific topic. It can make people learn, discover, explore, inspire, shape opinions, and when it's most successful, it can help shape policy. And I think that's the realm that we're trying to get into now.
John, do you think we, by which I mean us journalists, but also kind of readers and viewers, do you think we're better informed than we were when you were covering the Gulf War or the fall of the Berlin Wall, before we all had the smartphone in our pocket with lots of social news coming at us? Or do you feel that the kind of profusion of stuff creates a lot of distraction and a feeling among people they don't quite know where to look?
Sure. Let's cover it from a personal standpoint in terms of how my day job is. In the times when I was doing coverage in the 1990s, I would work on a 2.5 to 3 minute package for the day. So I could take a step back, to your point, analyze what I thought were the most important issues that needed to be into the report, accumulate the best interviews I could put into the analysis, and then perhaps do a live shot around it. Today's kind of agenda for me, if I'm on a story, is probably 10 to 12 live shots a day, up to 14, right. Sometimes 2 or 3 an hour. We have a digital producer there, but oftentimes the digital producer is not there, so I'm contributing to cnnbusiness.com or cnn.com at the same time. So you have that dual role. You're tweeting at the same time, and I'm also watching, to your point, the other trusted sources that are into the market to be able to find out if I'm as current as possible. And I think this is what's very fascinating, to your point about what is worth reading today. I think for us, when we poll our readers and our viewers, it's trust and reliability. The name that the National built over its young lifespan is about trust and reliability. I said it to you backstage. For The Economist, I feel exactly the same way. But there are platforms, for example, the Huffington Post, or Politico, or Business Insider, which have been able to enter the fray and build its own audience because what? It's reliable. It's got good content. To your point, Sashi, I want to read it. It's very, very good. But could we adapt to the new era, as John is the biggest question. I think 10 years ago, there's a real question whether CNN or BBC or CNBC or Bloomberg would be able to adapt to the new realities today. I think the answer for CNN is 100% the case, because we had to be a multi-platform player very quickly. We reached 480 million homes internationally, 2 out of 5 adults around the world, 200 million unique viewers on CNN.com, and 150 million followers on social media. So we've become pervasive on the multi-platform area. And I think what our viewers and our readers want from us is reliability and being very centrist in terms of our coverage. And I think there's a danger in the market today, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later in the panel, that there's an echo chamber going on, is that a certain political persuasion goes into their own little echo chamber and read what they kind of believe politically, and it kind of goes into a feedback loop, and that becomes their new reality. We try to break through it, but we want to be kind of really consistent when it comes to trust and reliability as a brand. I think that's foremost our attributes.
John brought up that tension between being fast and being thoughtful, actually taking the time to go and do some journalism before you put your story out. How do you find the right balance when you're editing The National? Because there's this constant pressure to produce stuff.
Yeah. Well, it is a balance, and it's also priorities. So for us, there are 3 priorities, let's say. So one is the stories that matter. What are the stories that are going to inform? What are the stories that are going to bring out emotion in people, that people relate to? So the stories that matter. Then there's the second element, which is the news. And that's the cycle, and you have to be part of the cycle. People expect it from you. You have to be current. You have to be up to date. So we might have the best news agenda planned for the day, and at 1 p.m. something changes, and it's the same for live television. Then suddenly your whole plan goes up in the air. So there's the stories that matter. There's the news, and there's the third element, which is enterprise journalism. And enterprise journalism really comes from our journalists. I mean, I get some pitches, amazing pitches, from not only our journalists based in the UAE, but your correspondents, your freelancers, and they will come to you with ideas that you couldn't have possibly seen. And that's what continues to expand our reach. So we have to maintain all 3. We, of course, use our social media feeds as almost separate entities. We have both the homepage editors, the social media journalists, working together with the different editors and journalists to think about how we're curating that so we remain up to date through that. And then we have our notifications, mobile apps. It's amazing the amount of outlets we have today to get the breaking news, but also the stories that matter and push them through. And in terms of scale and numbers, we don't just measure. Of course, we measure what is our top 10 read stories a day. We measure what in the last 10 minutes has been picking up what's trending, what do people want to know about, because that's our job. We have to also provide what people want to know about. But we really increasingly measure engaged time. Engagement time on the site, how long people actually spending reading, and how are they interested in what else we're proposing to them to read. One of the things as a newspaper editor I feel nostalgic about is the idea that people would actually read the newspaper and would follow the sequence I and the editors of the paper want them to read. And we no longer control that sequence. So we have to try to prod them, persuade them, nudge them to go in a certain sequence that we want to bring to them, stories that they wouldn't ordinarily read. And it is difficult because we could end up with a race to the bottom, because we all know the issues of clickbait. We all know the issues that if you sensationalize, you're going to get more attention. But I think people are beginning to see through that now. So, of course, for us, we never went down that path. And I think other publications and other outlets are beginning to think, okay, we cannot continue down this race to the bottom. And it is about making sure it's what moves people or interests them most.
Shashi, would you agree with that? Do you think that readers are getting tired of the kind of flashy, clickbaity headline that draws you into a story that turns out to be total nonsense? Or do you think there's still a large incentive in the media to produce that sort of stuff?
A little bit of both, but both of them brought up points that I think are important. And I think broadly I want to draw a very big distinction between media and social media, because they're not the same thing. And popularity isn't the same as influence, which I think is where a lot of people have gone wrong. Interestingly, 3 days ago, the Wall Street Journal came out with a poll that surveyed 1,000 Americans, and I'm sure, as most of you know, you can't get Americans to agree on a whole lot these days. But a majority of Americans trust Facebook less than the government, which is just remarkable because it's not something that you would have seen before. They think Facebook and some of the other tech platforms don't protect their privacy, don't protect their data, and spread misinformation and falsehoods. So I think, again, coming back to the role of intelligent media that's focusing on things that matter and taking a heavily curated approach, that will always matter.
Yeah, I was very struck covering the 2016 presidential election, quite how much totally fake stuff there was around. And you'd read stories about it, you knew it was there, but going around and talking to voters, people would spontaneously bring up tales about Hillary Clinton or less often Donald Trump that were just totally fantastical. And yet, because their friends had recommended them, on Facebook or Twitter. Generally,
Yeah.
it was Facebook, actually.
Ted Cruz
they
is-
came
yeah.
with a kind of trust.
Ted Cruz's father killed JFK.
Exactly, yeah, all that stuff. But you think people may be getting a little bit wiser there?
I hope so. I would like to think of myself as an optimist. I think sometimes the world has proven me wrong, but I think long-term people can tell the difference.
It's also an amazing trend now that beyond the analysis or enterprise reporting, which you rightfully bring up, Mina, we're having to be fact checkers for both sides of the political spectrum. It's extraordinary. That wasn't a role that we had to play. We would report the facts and let the public decide. Take the discussion around Brexit, John, which you know extremely well. This discussion that we'd be able to capture back £350 million a week to put into the NHS was complete fallacy. It was just ridiculous in terms of its narrative. I was sitting down with CEOs because I was in London for the last 3 weeks in the Brexit coverage that CNN was doing, and we've had 17 of the Fortune 100 declare the fact they're leaving the UK. And I was sitting with a conservative MP who said, we're going to be so much better off outside of the European Union. And there's just a gap with reality today. So one of the things I think as a responsibility for an international organization, or whether it's the national or Sachi's media platforms, is to do an acid test on what's being reported all the time. Like Donald Trump the other day sat in a press conference and said these are not people crossing the border from Mexico, but they're animals. I mean, it's just an incredible statement, and we've ever had a president say that. So a lot of our analysis and that narrative changed immediately to say, okay, this is taking us to a new low. Have we ever had a president say something like that? That's the social responsibility of a news organization, I think, at the same time. But we've never been in the position to be constantly fact-checking on both sides of the spectrum what's being put out today.
Yeah, that feels like a good thing that journalism can do, can't it? I mean,
Absolutely,
we have the
yeah.
resources, we have the time, we can go and fact check. That feels like a socially useful thing. And the Washington Post has its, kind of fact checking column, which has proved incredibly popular, particularly under Donald Trump, who is capable of coming out with things, amazing things the whole time. You see, the other day he talked about his father being born in Brooklyn. His father being born in Germany. His father was in fact born in Brooklyn, and his grandfather was born in Germany. So even on kind of small things like that, you can't really take his word.
But can I just say, sorry, but just on the fact-checking thing, the other problem is that sometimes something goes around and it would have only had a life cycle of 2 hours, 3 hours, but because we all jump on it to try to verify, knock it down, we give it a longer life cycle, and that's been one of my real frustrations of to choose what do we, I mean, of course, if it's coming from the President of the United States, it needs to be fact-checked, but then there are the second tier almost issues where if you ignore it, it might just go away, and if you don't ignore it, then you actually give it life that otherwise it wouldn't have had.
Yeah, that's really, what you choose to pay attention to is hugely important.
Well, in fact, this came up, sorry, I just wanted to pick up on your thought here. President Xi of China was in Italy when I was in London, and I was saying at the morning editorial meeting, I said, look, this is an extraordinarily important story. They want to set up a post in Trieste, which is the northeast side of Italy, and a port there to kind of go into Central Europe as their base, and perhaps the port of Genoa and looking into the south. The investment by China into Europe over the last 10 years has been over $300 billion. The Italians kind of think this is our time to be able to kind of go into getting some of that foreign direct investment, where you hear Brussels and Paris and Berlin starting to complain about it. Well, in the kind of narrative of Brexit and the narrative of Donald Trump, that story was getting ignored. So we had a pretty healthy discussion on our morning conference call to say, we can't ignore this story. This is too big of a tilt to the east. China coming into the heart of Europe, they want the foreign direct investment. Italy thinks it deserves it, but we can't let it slide off the news agenda because we're obsessed with one story, maybe Brexit, or obsessed with Donald Trump had to say at the border in Mexico. So it is our responsibility to keep some stories alive that normally would slide off the news agenda, if you will, John.
Shashi, can you tell us a bit about Pop Sugar? Journalists are always very interested in the kind of next generation of people who are going to be hopefully reading their stuff because we're interested in our survival and also because we want to know what they think about the world. That's a magazine squarely targeted at millennial women, and it's doing really well. What's the secret?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a cute story. It was started by a husband and wife team 13 years ago. Their last name is Sugar. And the wife wanted to start a blog about pop culture, but non-snarky, so trying to be a lot more positive in a world that was going increasingly towards snark and sensationalism. And over the past 13 years, it's grown, adding category by category. Today, it's the largest publication in the world for millennial women, some 90 million readers around the world each month. And I think it's just done a great job of growing with its reader base. So it started covering pop culture, then it covered entertainment, then it covered fitness, and now the founders are parents, and so there's a lot of parenting content as well. It's grown to be a very inclusive, diverse publication, publishes hundreds of stories a day, so actually incredible scale in what it's publishing, but very specific. And I think it still comes back to the fact that the brand does a lot to identify what its readers care about and spends a lot of time just producing content that can inspire people, can touch them, can make them dream a little bit and be a little bit more optimistic.
We've touched a little bit on the filter bubble problem. Do you have, just as yourself rather than when you're editing the National, do you have strategies for getting around your own personal filter bubbles? Are you kind of conscious that the news tends to come at you in a certain way and it's already been filtered a little bit?
Yeah, I think most journalists are aware of it and actually put in more effort than not just to know what else is out there. One of the ways I do it is by following people that I actually wholeheartedly disagree with on Twitter, because I know they'll share articles and they'll share stories or opinions that I wouldn't otherwise. And I read publications that, or I force myself, when I lived in the US, I used to force myself to watch all the different cable news channels, half an hour of each, just to be aware of the discussions that are going on. I do that less now because I'm in the Middle East, and thank God I don't have to pay as much attention to those discussions. But so you force yourself to watch at least half an hour of that discussion so that you're aware of it. But I think we have these biases, and it's really hard to remind yourself. Don't just knock it. Maybe you'll learn something from there. So just multiple sources, multiple writers, and people you disagree with, just to hear their side of it is really the way I do it.
John, how about you? Do you have ways of getting around your own, sort of the filters you've built up?
Yeah, for example, on Twitter, both the journalists that I follow, but the institutions that I follow, I think it's fantastic. If you use Twitter in the right way, you can be briefed for exactly what you had to do in watching television in the United States. Within 15 minutes, I kind of know what's going on around the world, which is fantastic. I have about 6 or 7 reliable apps on my phone, which is great, and they're always alerting me. I'm obsessed with BBC World Service Radio because I have a chance to listen to their business programs before I even get up and go to the office here, and I find the analysis is fantastic. What I find here in Trend in Abu Dhabi, and having lived here for 8 years, I see a parade of different people that go into the Spinnies, which carries the Financial Times on the weekends. So, I see people reading it for 2-3 hours and take the afternoon to digest it all. I think it is incredibly important to take a step back and digest some analysis and let it seep in, so that it would include The Economist and then go deeper to foreign affairs and spend a lot more time reading policy papers than I normally would, and I travel about half the month. Yeah. And I spend the time digesting this sort of analysis so we can put the breaking news into context. I mean, sometimes you get like 5 minutes before you're on air on a breaking news story, and you have to be incredibly well briefed and can't go read in on something to pick up the nuance. So it is important I use the tool of Twitter. I use 5 or 6, 7 apps constantly, and I make it a point to digest deeply local papers, local websites, and go deeper in international analysis, so I'm always prepared.
Yeah. Shashi, just going back to you, you've been a sort of media entrepreneur for a while, right? And one of the things that interests me in this area is that often the predictions that people make turn out to be totally wrong 10 years down the line, right? So in our own business, The Economist, we assumed that people would stop buying the thing on paper and would just read it on their phones or digitally. And it turns out we were totally wrong. People like paper. And some of our most enthusiastic paper readers are people who are aged kind of 20, 25 years old, which is the opposite of what we expected. What do you think are the kind of myths that are widely held at the moment about the direction media is going that will turn out to be total nonsense?
I think the idea that technology will be the savior for media is a huge myth. I mean, looking back a few years when the iPad came out, magazine companies rushed to publish iPad-specific editions. Rupert Murdoch spent millions to put out an iPad app. Huge failure. Condé Nast spent a lot of money to put out Vogue, Vanity Fair, New Yorker on iPad. Also didn't really work. I think Apple News Plus will potentially be the same issue for companies that are rushing in for that space. And I think for us, we kind of look at the real world as something that's very different than what you're seeing on your phone or on your screen. And we're kind of going full force with the idea that offline is the new online. And if technology was going to be the solution, books wouldn't really exist anymore. And people are reading more than ever when it comes to books. So I agree. When I was in university, I subscribed to The Economist in part because I wanted to feel a little bit smarter or project that I was a little bit smarter.
It worked.
Which, yeah, I guess it kind of worked. Sadly, I stopped subscribing, so I can't say that I'm a subscriber anymore. So maybe something went astray. But,
sorry. No,
sorry. Our magazine's still growing, and so I think that print still is very meaningful. It's very difficult to recreate the experience of leaning into a magazine or a newspaper or looking at large, full-format visuals. That format just doesn't exist on a phone, and so you can't capture the same level of emotion, you can't capture the same experience on a screen.
I was going to use the example now where the technology and social media is actually a benefit of good on certain stories. Last week I was covering the Brunei decision on LGBT and adultery and the stoning of individuals, which seemed to come out of the blue. It was being worked on phase 2 and phase 3 of their policies for a number of years, but just landed at the doorstep. And then George Clooney writing his op-ed online, which I thought set the narrative for the story to say we want to take a stand, and Ellen DeGeneres and Elton John both coming into the fray. But we actually took a step back from the business side and said, okay, what is Brunei all about? So having that op-ed online started the story, but then CNN took a different spin and said, okay, let's take a step back. Brunei doesn't have the oil and gas reserves that it had before, right? It has its wealth there, $40 billion sovereign fund. The Chinese were into Brunei in November. So if you look deeply, the Sultan of Brunei doesn't feel like he needs to be tilting to the West. He has Western hotel properties, 5, 7-star luxury resorts, which he's dependent on. The rest is not very transparent. But we were able to shed light with a deep dive analytically because we knew where to find the information and use the social media, use that online story that George Clooney put out to tell a much wider narrative where Brunei is going today and why they made the decision, which I think is a good way for us to add value to a story in a deeper way.
Yeah, absolutely. Mina, I wanted to come to you. I mean, you, a similar organization to The Economist in structure in that you've got a team of correspondents, all around the world who are, kind of subject experts, right, and who write for The National. I'm sometimes aware, managing my lot, that they're under huge kind of time pressures, even more so than before, because of the things you mentioned. There are so many outlets now, news story breaks in Brunei, the same author has to do, a podcast, an instant news story, send some tweets, perhaps record a video. And I fret sometimes about the effect that has on the kind of quality and the kind of thoughtfulness of what gets done. How do you make sure that your standards stay high?
Well, we're lucky because we have never big enough in a newsroom, but a good-sized team that can work on the different streams. So really for the correspondents, for the people getting the story, it's get the story. That's what counts. We in HQ and with certain editors, our role is to think about how we're packaging it in advance, especially if it's a story that we're working on, if it's an exclusive for us. So giving the space to the person who's actually the newsmaker or the news gatherer to really think about the story, make sure it's solid, make sure it's properly sourced, all of those elements, while keeping in mind at the beginning, briefing them and constant meetings, phone calls, emails about, okay, how you need to plan the story. And so equipping them in advance to think about if there's going to be audio, this is what you need to do. If there's going to be video, this is what they're going to need to do. If you need to get a freelance photographer, etc. So equipping them in that and then saying, okay, stop worrying about those elements, go get the story. And once they bring it back, it's our job to package and prepare and so forth. But I think it's one of those things. I don't think technology is going to be the savior or the destroyer of media. Again, it's a tool. And so in some ways, it's amazing because now I have journalists who will never see the print edition because we only distribute in the UAE, who get to see their stories and feel very excited about them when, especially we do some of our immersive storytelling tools that we use, that they feel a connection with their stories. That's not just a story that's published on a stale website and then gone. And so not only about thinking how they divide their time and how they can do use all these tools to get the story out there as much as possible, also making them excited about how it's going to be produced and the spread it can have. And I think in some ways technology has given more opportunity to, whether it's Pop Sugar or to The National, to names that are newer in the market, to get out there and to get amazing journalists to want to come and work with us because they know that their reach will be much further than just a local paper if they're not based out here. Just another element about the technology element of media. It is about monetization. I know here we're not really here to talk about the business of media, but it makes such a difference to us because we are struggling, and I don't think any of us can deny that the changes are forcing even journalists who usually only think editorial thinking about commercial because they want to see the spread of what they're writing. So monetization is an issue, and it's one of those things where we have to deal with the tech giants who are benefiting greatly. And if we look at even just our market here in the Middle East, the amount of spending that's happening in print advertising has gone down to about 45% in the last year. And that money is not translating online to the website. So the websites are not full of ads. Instead, they're going to social media influencers, the social media companies, so Facebook, Twitter, but also, of course, Google, the big part of it, and then events. So thinking about if you, an audience, care about having serious, good journalism, if you're willing to pay for that, if your institutions are willing to pay for subscriptions or otherwise, we in the region don't have many paywalls, and so making that decision, when is the time to put up the paywall or not, all of these things are actually coming to conversations that journalists before didn't have to worry about, but they are increasingly worried about.
Have to worry about them now, for sure.
80% of the ad dollar goes on digital platforms to Facebook and Google.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know this, you know the game. So,
We're nodding wearily.
And, well, in fact, though, there has to be greater attention to the dominance of those two platforms. We're also at this inflection point where, TV was the major gainer for revenues for CNN, for the last 3 decades. Let's put it that way. There's more of a digital spend, but to Mina's point, we're at a case now where the digital revenues are just not that high yet because of the value proposition vis-a-vis TV. So it's an inflection point, which I think is an important one, and we have to make sure that good brands don't get destroyed along the way. I'm sure this has been a challenge for The Economist, the same thing for CNN, a local paper, and startups. Everybody has to think about not getting destroyed along the way. Backstage, I was mentioning to you about Yahoo. I remember in the early 2000s, Yahoo was going to go on digital television only. They were going to be Yahoo TV, and they were going to dominate the landscape and kind of wipe out the likes of CNN. It was just too early because the technology didn't support it. There wasn't the broadband to support online television. The AT&T acquisition of Time Warner, which we're part of the family of, is done because this is the right time. We're on the cusp of 5G, and the CNN Go philosophy is we want to reach you on your mobile phone, on your desktop, on your iPad, and we're going to continue to reach you on CNN right across the board in terms of television. I think the timing is right for that sort of revolution, but it was almost 20 years too early when Silicon Valley was thinking about it, and the technology didn't support it. So hopefully that's going to actually provide a new impetus to CNN in terms of distribution platforms.
And as a viewer, will you be watching something that is like the CNN feed, or will it be much more kind of pick and mix, where you say, oh, I'm interested in, politics in the UAE and football, but I'm not interested in China?
Well, it's fascinating. I won't use the CNN example, but I'll use maybe Sashi's target audience, which is the millennials. A friend of mine's son is a baseball analyst for Major League Baseball. He's 24, came out of university. He had a blog. They hired him to do video blogs, and it just has gone viral. So they've hired him as an analyst for Major League Baseball, even for the World Series. But to the point, John, the millennials are watching 4 platforms at the same time. So they'll have the major game on one corner of the screen. They'll have another game on the other side of the screen. They'll have one on an iPad device, and then they're commenting to it on a smart TV. So I think that's where it's going to be going. You'll be taking 4 feeds from the same event when it comes to sports. And I think when CNN offers through AT&T on the platform on the smartphone, you'll have a selection of HBO to CNN Headline News, to CNN International at the same time. That's the idea. That's the holy grail, hopefully.
So Shashi, I think we can all accept there's no kind of end point in this transformation, right? Technology will keep changing media for decades. It always has, since the printing press came along. But what do you think your companies will look like in 5 or 10 years' time from the point of view of the reader? What will readers be doing, or viewers, that they're not doing now?
The big transformation that our parent publishers are going through is trying to better align their interests with their end readers, which is subscriptions, which I think I think is an important transformation to be made. I mean, we've tried to, although we're predominantly advertising funded, we view our primary customer as our reader first and foremost. And I think advertising, if it's the primary source of revenue, can kind of shift you away from aligning your interests with your reader. So I would say that 5 or 10 years from now, I would hope that subscriptions represent a bigger part of our business because it will align what we're producing with who we are producing it for. Commerce is starting to become an increasing part of what we do in the segments that we're in, so fashion, luxury, and tech. We've noticed how much purchase intent we can drive from the editorial content that we produce, and it's natural that if we can find a way to capture some of that value without sacrificing our editorial integrity, that's something that's important. And then the last part, when I mentioned earlier that offline is the new online for us, a lot of experiential activations for us, not just in the UAE or in Dubai or in Abu Dhabi, but all across the region.
You know, can I ask a similar question to you? I know you've got this commercial challenge at the moment with, you know, perhaps moving to a paywall, perhaps not. What do you think the National's going to look like in, you know, kind of 5-10 years' time?
I think we'll keep print.
Yeah.
Because I agree with you. I think there is an experience with print that continues to inspire people, to educate, to create a connection, but that's your niche audience, let's say. And in 5 to 10 years, or 5 years at least, that trajectory, there is much greater focus on not only video, but audio. So we're already, of course, experimenting with some of that, but it'll get much larger as the technology changes. People increasingly now outside of the region, but it's beginning to come to the region in terms of having Alexa or other tools where they'll say, you know, tell me what are the top headlines, and we want to be providing that. So we'll be thinking much more about audio. And another one is personalization. And we're seeing this increasingly. So in terms of not only the time that people are spending engaged with a particular media outlet, it's also finding what they particularly want. And so we're seeing this with streaming now, for example, Netflix and others. What does this mean to be able to stream the news when you want it, or entertainment when you want it? It'll be the same for us. So it's really thinking about that personalization in terms of the time we're producing certain stories for certain readership. And as we think about regional and international audiences, because that's our biggest growth at the moment, it is thinking of time zones and what's relevant to them. So personalization, audio, video, and hanging on to print as long as I can.
No, print is great. I was talking to a technologist recently who said that, you know, if somebody, to your point, Shashi, if somebody invented the printed book or the printed magazine now, and it was a new product, we'd be so over the moon about it. You know, it never runs out of battery. You can drop it on the floor, and the screen doesn't smash. It does all sorts of wonderful things that other technologies don't do. I feel like we're more optimistic than I had thought we might be going into this. I think if you gathered a bunch of journalists 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, to talk about the future of media and technology, it would be more doomy than we've been. It feels like there's been a bit of a turning point, and people can see that there's not an end point, as I said before. You know, it's not that Google and Facebook are suddenly going to go away and stop disrupting our businesses, but we can kind of see how we can carry on doing, you know, kind of what we care about and just about make money. Do you think that's fair, John?
Well, where I have concerns, I agree with you overall, but where I do have concerns is during the Brexit debate, we saw the protests on both sides, right, leading up to the big votes that were there. The narratives are so starkly different. So you wonder, there is no common ground in the middle, which I think is a responsibility for us as the major news organizations to fill that void. But I have great concerns that this feedback loop gets worse in markets, not better. I think it's a real danger of that. We see that in the Middle East with some organizations trying to filter in and fervor agitation within the youth, and there's high youth unemployment. I had this conversation with the Prime Minister of Jordan. I think that is a really major concern. I've never seen America so divided. So we're at a stage right now, there's a threat to the post-World War II institutions, whether it's the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank. They're all under threat because there's a whole swath of society that feels like they've been left out because of globalization. And, you know, the Trumps of the world, the Brexiters, have really stoked that flame, to be honest with you. And I think in that media circle where there's a feedback loop, you can't break through that thinking, John. I think To see the UK at the cusp of leaving the European Union because of misleading campaigns on one side, I think is a tragedy. I really do think this is a real danger to society. It's a culture summit. I think it's our responsibility to kind of feed into this to make sure our population is educated on both sides.
And so to what extent is this our fault, collectively as journalists? Are we reflecting the world as it is out there, or are we making it worse? What do you think, Mina?
Well, I mean, I will respond to that, but I want to pick up about what John said. I think, yes, there's a lot of pessimism about where is the world going, especially when we think about, the new world order, what does it look like, and so forth. But it's that concern of the media becoming more polarized to reflect that politics, rather than saying we can't get caught up in this crazy politics. But it's difficult because what we find is opinionated pieces, those that go really on a slant, get read increasingly and get shared and go viral increasingly more than the smart, stable, analysis pieces, except for the fact checking. That's where we get our strength. In terms of your question, look, I think we do have a responsibility, absolutely, and that goes back to my point. There are certain things that honestly would have not gotten any attention. So somebody puts out a tweet or a thought on social media that ordinarily they'd throw away in a cafe and nobody would have heard it except the two people sitting next to them. But suddenly they have a platform where they're all publishers. Everyone today is a publisher. And if we, as the traditional legacy media, whatever you want to call it, give it a greater platform by using it, then we're stoking those fires. And I think we do have responsibility to sometimes either ignore or take down some of those voices.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm afraid we're out of time. I'd like to thank our panelists. Thank you, Mina. Thank you, Shashi. Thank you, John. If any of you have any questions, we didn't get to that, but there's going to be a workshop this afternoon. So if there's anything you particularly want to talk to, please bring your questions there. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. We'll just steal from some of your time a question. Safe.
Yeah, my name is Saif. I'm the Undersecretary of Culture and Tourism in Abu Dhabi. Thank you for being here with us. I have a comment and a question. First comment, I think, Mina, you just started to talk about it, which is the importance of media literacy in a world where people are exposed to all sorts of media throughout the day. I think the onus is on some actors. I don't know if it's media industry or not, because depending on your political stance, you could be shooting yourself in the foot. But how does one teach people to decide what is accurate in terms of media and to decide for oneself whether to run with a tweet or run with an article or whatnot? And I think in a world where Americans, for example, are exposed to at least 12 hours of media a day, this could be a double-edged tool, and there needs to be some efforts when it comes to media literacy, and I think maybe organizations that take the lead in that can also define an advantage for them and some sort of strength in the era to come. With regards to publishing migrating to digital, I see you, and I see that the advertising dollars are not going online, and they're being well dispersed in social media, but also there's plenty of social media influencers today that they're losing their bargaining power in a sense, and you have the likes of the Fat Jewish and others, those you follow them, who have called it quits out of the storm. You have some resorts in France and in Southeast Asia who have announced that they're going to stop dealing with influencers who email them saying, please give us accommodation or we're going to tweet for you. So that shows you their waning power, so you have a position there. But going back to the basics, this is the Culture Summit, and I think there is a big responsibility as well on media organizations to help spread whatever happens in the world of culture and arts out, help preserve and protect culture and heritage. It's a big responsibility. It's not going to be paid for by advertising dollars. So what is the threshold that you choose to invest as organizations in doing that bit of public service is up to you, and I think that's going to be part of the conversations in the days to come. Thank you for giving me this.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. I think we need to wrap the session up, so thank you all for being here. Appreciate all the panelists for sharing their thoughts and experiences. There's a lot that we can talk about media, responsibility, definitely. We can talk about the purge with social media, the fake followers and all, and how that can impact your respective platforms. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. We have a quick break for a quick coffee, so please make it quick, all right?